Anybody know when the best time is for a dentist appointment? Never. I'm getting a lot of nevers, and I understand why you would say that. I really do. But actually, there is a time that is best for an appointment, and that would be at 2:30. 2:30, everybody. This morning, we're going to talk about suffering. Suffering for some of us is going to the dentist. And I think that we might be able to apply what we're going to study this morning to that scenario, although it might be a bit trivial compared to some of the other sufferings that we're going to consider. I talked in our adult Sunday school class this morning that I was going to predict the future today, so here you go. You're going to suffer. And I hope that doesn't mean through this message. But we are all going to suffer in this life. But let's begin with one of the bigger categories of suffering that we might face as Christians. We might face the suffering that comes with persecution. Now, what does persecution look like in the church today? We're going to read about the persecution of a church in the first century, the church in a town called Smyrna. But that persecution might seem distant and unrelated to the persecution that we might see today. And so what does persecution look like in the church today? More specifically, what does persecution look like in our context? Because if we broaden it out, it can look a lot different in other contexts. For instance, this morning, we're blessed to have Mandy and Tiago and Theo and Mateo all with us. And they're about to enter into a context that's significantly different than ours. Christian persecution in India is overt, and in some instances it's legal. It is the policy of the government in some parts of India. Recently, an Indian pastor was sitting in his home in Western India talking with members of his church when a group of Hindus, including police officers, burst in, accusing the Christians of trying to convert Hindus by fraud. After interrogation and intimidation in the home, the police took the pastor and two elders from the church to the police station in a larger town. The pastor was jailed without due legal process and forced to pay a large fine. And that's just one example of persecution and suffering that Christians might face in India. But we're a long way from India here in Mott, both geographically and in culture and government and religion. There's no overt persecution of Christians in Mott. There's no reason to fear being arrested or killed for going to church or for talking to your friends and neighbors about Jesus. It just isn't here. We're very fortunate in our context to have such safety and freedom as Christians. We're in the minority, though, when you consider the global church. It's uncommon around the world for Christians to experience the same acceptance and the same protection that we have here. Around the world, persecution of Christians includes arrests, murders, kidnappings, torture, economic oppression and social exclusion or even exile, and more as well. Around here, persecution doesn't look very similar to anything on that list. We might be victims of a loss of economic opportunity at times because we're Christians. We might have some social persecutions. We might feel ostracized by our own families. But really nothing near the scale of persecution that Christians in other countries face, and nothing near the scale that we're going to see the church facing in Revelation chapter 2 this morning. But I wouldn't be surprised, though, if persecution of Christians in America increases over the coming years. And at some point, it will probably come even to Mott. But here's the key in all of this. I don't think it's something to be afraid of. When Jesus warned the church in Smyrna about the coming persecution, he wanted to give them hope, not to stir up fear. So with that, let's get into Revelation chapter 2. We'll read verses 8 through 11. Revelation 2, verses 8 through 11. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last, who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. I think we'll get to the persecution that we're going to see here, but let's start with just the introduction in verse 8. The city of Smyrna was second only to Ephesus in terms of size and significance in this region. Probably the most notable piece of trivia that we have about Smyrna is that it claimed to be the birthplace of the ancient Greek poet Homer. But more significant to our study today is the fact that it was home to a temple for the worship of Tiberius Caesar. It was to this city that Jesus identified himself as being the first and the last who died and came to life. While many of the Caesars claimed to be deity, and some were worshipped as a god like Tiberius was in Smyrna, Jesus was truly divine. He is the first and the last. He was before all things, and he will continue unchanged for all of eternity. And he demonstrated his divinity in a way that none of the Caesars ever did. He died and came back to life. And that death and resurrection should serve as a great encouragement to us today, as I think that it was meant to be an encouragement to the church in Smyrna as they were facing persecution in their time. They hear that they ought to persevere even to death, and in the face of death, it is good to know that we are serving a God who died and came back to life. You see, Jesus knew about their suffering. They were not forgotten in their persecutions, nor had they gone unnoticed as they persevered there. It would seem that their persecution began in perhaps economic terms, as they are described as being poor. And we don't have much information about the church in Smyrna directly as it relates to this, but we see in other churches in the first century what I would describe as economic sanctions that were placed on Christians in some cases, and in other places, voluntary forfeiture of their wealth. All of this could lead to poverty among Christians. And as we know, poverty often goes hand in hand with suffering. But the poor Christians in Smyrna were described as being rich. This calls to mind Jesus' teaching in Luke 6:20 when he said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." Or maybe more clearly, it reminds me of the teaching in James, that God has chosen those who are poor to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom. It can be easy to gloss over teachings like these because we recognize from the whole scope of the Bible that being poor isn't a virtue, and being rich isn't a moral failure. Abraham, David, and Job are prime examples of extremely rich individuals who had great faith and were loved by God. So the teaching isn't that you have to be poor to have great faith. And certainly it can't be that all poor people have great faith. There are plenty of poor people who reject Jesus as well. And yet this theme seems to be a recurring one throughout the Bible, that God cares about the poor, and they seem to be recipients of his special attention. And poverty has a way of developing and deepening a person's faith. Many of the trials and tribulations that we might face in this life are economic trials, and these have the ability to develop character and deepen our faith. And so while God acts without partiality between poor and rich, there does seem to be a sense in which his special attention and blessing is on the poor. Now, I would argue that very few people in America are truly poor when you consider the whole world. than 0.5% of the U.S. population is homeless. In North Dakota, almost 95% of households have at least one car. The average household in North Dakota has 2.8 cars. In contrast, about 8% of the world's population lives on less than $2.15 per day. That's over 500 million people, 500 million people, more than that, living each day with less than what I spend on a gallon of gas or on a dozen eggs. About 10 years ago, I spent 2 months in Senegal, West Africa, and I witnessed poverty that we just don't really comprehend here. I worked with a home for boys that housed 12 boys in a small complex that had 2 bedrooms, 1 common room, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a small courtyard, where they played soccer with bare feet and a soccer ball that didn't stay inflated. And yet, those boys had it good. They had a roof and a bed, and they ate 3 meals a day. I saw plenty of people while I was there who were worse off than them. See, God has great concern for those people. And as His people, we ought to be concerned for them as well. I think this might be a bit of a bunny trail off of the point of Revelation 2 here, but I think at times we need a reminder of what the world is like outside our little part of the globe. We are the hands and feet of God, and we should care for the people that He cares about. But getting back to the point here, the church in Smyrna was rich in spite of their poverty. They had remained faithful in the face of their poverty and in the face of the slander that had been leveled against them by the Jews in Smyrna. But those Jews, we find here, were false Jews. Maybe instead of being Jewish, they were Jewish, like George Santos. They're described as a synagogue of Satan. Now that, I think, is pretty harsh. They should have been gathering in their synagogue in order to worship God, to study the Holy Scriptures of the Old Testament, but they had become so twisted in their understanding that they were following Satan instead. Rather than loving people, they were persecuting the Christians in their city, and it seemed that this preoccupied them to the point that they failed to follow God and instead were opposing Him. I don't think that they were actively engaged in devil worship. It wasn't that they were seeking Him out and worshiping Him, but their practice had moved so far away from true Jewish faith and the teaching of the Old Testament that they might as well have been worshiping Satan. Now, I personally would hesitate to use language like that to describe anyone, but I think that perhaps there have been Christian churches throughout history that we might describe as synagogues of Satan. Churches in the Middle Ages that carried out the Crusades seem to have been far from God. Churches in Nazi Germany that supported and enabled the Nazi war efforts and the eventual Holocaust might be in a similar category. Churches here in the United States that defended slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries could be questioned as well. And even today, polling indicates that nearly half of American evangelicals don't believe that Jesus was God, an essential part of the gospel. Half, almost half, of people who are evangelicals or claim to be. Many of these people are united in churches around political ideas more often than they are around God and the Bible. And a church full of these people might be accurately described as a synagogue of Satan today. And these synagogues of Satan, if I allow myself to call them that, they do nothing to further the kingdom of God and often hinder it instead. They may even be found to persecute genuine Christians and claim to be doing it in the name of Christ. And who knows, we might face a persecution of that sort here in Mott in the future. I pray that we don't become the ones who would be doing the persecution. But I'm not too worried about this group of people that I see before me today. But this letter to the church in Smyrna wasn't just about the persecution and tribulations that they had already been facing. I think it was meant to be an encouragement to stand firm in the face of the persecution which was coming. Verse 10 says, "Do not fear what you are about to suffer." As we sit here with Mandy and Chiago in our church, knowing that they will soon be entering a culture that is at least somewhat hostile toward Christianity, I hope that all of us, and them especially, can be encouraged by this same call to not be afraid. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Now, personally, I'm kind of glad that this wasn't written directly to us, because their suffering was going to be great. And yet, I think they are good words to us in all times. Do not fear the suffering that you are about to face. The suffering of the church in Smyrna was going to be imprisonment and testing. It probably involved torture. It was intense persecution. The suffering for us might not be persecution at all, but we will also suffer. The time may come when we do face overt persecution for our faith, but that's not something I expect in the near future, at least. But our suffering might be the loss of a loved one. It might be financial struggles. It might be health problems. It may be bad weather or a car accident. It may be a dentist appointment. And it may be relationship problems. Maybe it's just the effects of growing older. You see, we suffer in a lot of different ways, and each of these things will impact different people differently. But the point is that we don't need to fear what we are about to suffer. None of our suffering is outside of the control of God. For the church in Smyrna, God not only knew about it, but he told them the nature of the suffering and the period of time that it would last. And it's not necessarily explicitly stated here, but it seems that at the end of this suffering, at least some of them would die. He called them to be faithful to the point of death. But even if the suffering was going to lead to death, Jesus told them, do not fear. Why did they not need to fear? Because God knew what was happening. They weren't on their own. He was with them, and he would reward them. It's at this point in my notes that I might just go off script. I've been debating this, and I think I'm going to. You see, I wanted from this point through the rest of the sermon mostly to give you hope in the face of your suffering, that something good would come of it. And there are places in scriptures that we could look at that. There are great places of hope that we could see. When James 1 says we can count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds, we could look at that and see the hope that we have. But the more I thought about this, that's not what we see in Revelation 2, verses 8 through 11. It's not. He doesn't tell them anything good is going to come of this, except that if they're faithful unto death, they would receive the crown of life. It reminds me, I think, not so much of James 1, to be joyful when you encounter various trials. It reminds me instead of the perspective of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. As they were persecuted for their faith in the Babylonian Empire, there was a great golden statue which was erected, and all the people were called on to bow down to it. And when they would not bow, there were consequences. They would be thrown into a fiery furnace. And their response was that they trusted that their God could deliver them from this. And I wonder if some of those in the church in Smyrna thought the same. And yet, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said that even if their God would not deliver them, they still would not bow. I think that is the lesson of the church in Smyrna. It's not that our suffering leads to proven character and hope, although it can. The lesson is that the suffering that we may face, we may not understand it. We may not see anything good coming out of it. And yet, we don't need to fear it. And we don't need to try to find our own way out of it. We can persevere, even to the point of death. Now, And like I said, I don't think that any of us, certainly not many of us, if any at all, are going to have to persevere the sufferings of persecution to the point of death. But there are trials and temptations that each of us will face. There are things that will make us consider, is it really worth it for me to continue to be faithful to God? I would encourage you to persevere, even to the point of death. Remain faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life, is what Jesus said to the church in Smyrna. This was a message from the God who had died and had come back to life. If anyone could promise good things to come after death, it was him, and he promised them the crown of life. And then more broadly, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. Jesus has conquered death for us. If we remain faithful to him, we have nothing to fear in death. There's only great gain and reward for us in death. It is not an end, but the beginning of something new and something better. No explanation was given to Smyrna. They weren't told, this is why you're going to suffer, or this is what's going to come about because you were faithful in your suffering. It's going to change the world. None of that happened. It reminds me a little bit of Job. When Job went through his suffering, and he came to the end, and God finally speaks to him, God never told Job, this is why you suffered. Sometimes we don't have answers. Sometimes we don't know the reasons. We're just called to be faithful. To be faithful, even unto death. Be faithful even as our suffering would increase. Be faithful even as you're ostracized from your family. Be faithful even if it costs you a fortune. If you become poor, be faithful. Be faithful no matter the situation. Now, the things that we're going to face in this life, because like I said, we're all going to suffer. I doubt that it's going to be like the suffering of Smyrna, but we're all going to suffer. I don't think we can face them alone. I think we need Jesus in our suffering. And we can call out to him for wisdom as we suffer. In this, I do like the truth of James chapter 1 that we can look at. After he talks to them about the trials that they would be facing and the joy they could have in it, James says that if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. See, we need wisdom as we suffer in this life, whether it's persecution or for any other reason. So we should all ask God for wisdom to lead us through the sufferings that we face. We can also benefit from the community of other Christians here who can help us in our suffering, who can support us, and can help carry the loads that we're forced to carry. But no matter what comes, we can trust Jesus. I think we ought to then obey the wisdom that he gives. Reminds me of the old hymn, Trust and Obey. For there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. That song goes on to say, what he says, we will do. Where he sends, we will go. Never fear, only trust and obey. I think that is the message to the church in Smyrna. Never fear, only trust and obey. Remain faithful. Trust and obey. You know, church history is full of stories of faithful Christians who suffered for Christ. Though they faced unimaginable persecution, they trusted and they obeyed. And yet plenty of them went on to die for that faith and for that obedience. But not one of them has gone unnoticed by God. Though they may have been unnoticed by the world, God has noticed. He has seen them, and he rewards them handsomely in his kingdom. Now, I hope that our suffering may be less than theirs. I pray that we would not be led into temptations and trials. I pray regularly for the safety of our missionaries like Mandy and Chiago and Dave and Colleen, Randy and Debbie. But whether we are missionaries around the world or we are faithful followers of Christ here in Mott, I'm confident that we don't need to fear suffering, no matter the form it takes or the severity that it brings. To close, I think that there is great comfort in the wise words of C.S. Lewis, who was once asked, "Why do the righteous suffer?" To which he replied, "Why not?" And went on to say, "They're the only ones who can take it." Sometimes we may suffer because we're the only ones who can take it. I don't know why the church in Smyrna had to suffer, and I don't know why each of us will suffer some of the things that we will face. But I do know that they could take it, and I do know that we can take it. Not because we are strong people, but because we have Christ. They didn't need to fear because God was with them through it all, and I know that we can approach our own sufferings in the same way. Let me pray for us this morning. God, it's a sobering reminder to know that we will suffer. God, it's humbling when we realize that we won't always know the reasons for our suffering or what will be the outcome of our suffering. God, I pray that you would strengthen us to be faithful to you. Faithful throughout whatever suffering may come, even to the point of death. We thank you that you see and you reward those who remain faithful. Amen.
Our closing hymn today is 527, I Know